Hi, Kyra. How are you? I can't hear you.
I'm doing well, but I'm worried that is the sound quality not good?
No, that sounds good.
Oh, it's giving me a message.
You look like you're in the bedroom or something. I can see your closet.
It's my office, and I haven't figured out. I got a new desk, and I haven't figured out quite where to put it yet. So you get to look at my mirrored closets because I live in the 70s.
Yeah. Hey, Danny and Karen, I make you guys co-hosts. I'm going to switch over to, actually, I can run on this. It'll be fine. I'll just change my name. Rename.
Woohoo, we made it. We made it.
Yes.
I'll be right back.
Just so you guys know, we already have an attendee in the room.
Nobody has, no, Hassan, I was saying yay about something else.
Yeah. But like, don't worry about it because the final video, I will edit the beginning and the end. So,
Ebony's trying to log on.
Is she part of the panel? Panelists?
The facilitator.
Okay. To tell her wait, I'll move her in. I have the power.
I love it.
Try not to let it go to your head, man.
Hi, Ebony.
Hi, Jean. I thought my name was wrong again. I was like, is my name wrong in the thing?
Yeah, my name comes up wrong, different every time. Like sometimes I'm Raquel, sometimes I'm Khalid, sometimes I'm Paul. Those are at least the positive names that people know me by. Yeah.
Hi, Amy. Hi, everyone.
Hey, Adrian, nice to meet you. I think, Adrian, you might be the only one. No, there's a few other folks that may not know one another.
And we're waiting on Fatima still. You sent her the link.
We're waiting on Fatima and Yusef. Yusef asked me to send him the link, and I said he should have received it. Did we send him an email? Can we?
Yeah, I did it. Yeah.
Can you send it again?
Sure. Let me go in the account.
Man, Mimi, why are you looking at me like, I know you're looking at your screen, but it felt like you was looking at me some type of way.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Man, I started getting nervous.
When I'm looking at you, I'm looking down. So
Okay.
I can, when I look down, I can see you.
Oh,
I got nervous.
Oh.
Yeah, she looked at me.
No, I was looking up here because that's where my tabs are.
Well,
Who am I supposed to check?
Colin, I panicked because I didn't think you were going to be on. I called Layla and Mimi because I was like, I am not about to be the opening act.
Hey, Khalid, who am I supposed to send an email to?
We're supposed to get an email to Yusef, Bunchy, Shakur. He has 2 emails. One's University of Michigan and the other one's at Gmail. I just send it to both. Do you want me to resend it?
I think I only have for the Michigan one. Can you text me the Gmail one?
Yeah, it should be on that. Let me see.
On the text that he sent us.
Okay.
I'll just send you his email alone.
Oh, I found it.
You found it?
Yeah.
I have to say, Khalid, I'm less scared of you than I used to be.
Me?
Because here's why. I saw you curse out the media in La Mesa, but then at the end, you were like, thank you. I was like, that's when you mad, but you were raised right. Like,
hey, how do you end a speech like that? Like I was like, thank you.
I yield my time.
I'm telling you, is it Kyra? Is that how I say your name? Kyra?
Kyra.
Kyra.
Yes.
Let me tell you, that moments of that speech give me great joy. When I sometimes I'll just text about the blue, like, hey, remember when you said crocodile tears and the milk from your precious bonds?
So first of all, I didn't know that it was live. And so I just figured, well, they'll edit out everything anyways. So you know what, I might as well let them have it. And the politicians who did it before me were just saying such, BS. So I figured, you know what, no harm, no foul. And then people are like, oh, they just cut off your knee. I'm looking at my text. They just cut your news feed off.
I wasn't watching it on television. I was watching it online, and there was no cutoff. So it was, and I was like, he just told them all their business out loud, but then at the end was like, thank you very much. I've been doing that at work ever since then. Like, I'll just like say something crazy, like just mad at everybody, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I kind of lost a little bit. So then I think it's okay if I just go, thank you.
At least the full, at least the whole last minute, the whole last 60 seconds, I was internally trying to think like, how am I supposed to stop this? Like, you don't, it's difficult to go from there to just walking like, what do I do?
I have a number of suggestions in case you find yourself in that situation again.
Yeah.
Moonwalk.
Moonwalk, yeah. So we don't have a lot of time. I see Annie Rios has joined us. Hey, Annie. Yusef, Bunchy, Shakur from Detroit. So you all, this is meant to be, you know, just a real comfortable kind of conversation. I'll begin just with a quick intro to political education, and then I'll, I think there's a way for me to hide my, hide self-view. And so I'll disappear for a while. Danny Widener is a professor at UCSD, and he's one of the facilitators, and Ebony Tyree, also a very close friend of mine, professor at City College, is the other facilitator. So they're the ones that will be asking the questions. Brother, I see Brother Yusef, Bunchy, Shakur from Detroit, community movement builders, and restoring the neighborhood back to the hood is here as well. I'm just so excited, man. What an amazing group of folks. Danny, do we already have Dr. Fatima? Has she joined already?
We missing only Fatima.
Yeah.
Okay, she's probably going to join exactly at 6 because I didn't have a number to text her. Okay. That we're logging on early.
Okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
As facilitators, when the panelists begin to answer the questions, do we mute our video? Do we go away too? Can we go away?
I leave the video on.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so for the texting, like Mimi and me, we're gonna be turning our videos off, and then whoever turn our video off, it will disappear from the screen, so you won't see us. The same thing with Khalid as well. Now, as panelists, if you need to like stop and do something or whatever it is, just go ahead and turn your camera off. When you come back, you turn it on, you come back on.
Yeah, and Ebony, to answer your question, I would leave it on because it'll be too weird for you to like disappear and then appear, ask a question, then disappear again. If there's something happening where you have to kind of not be there, just, you know, mute your screen or whatever, but don't go into hide mode. I think it'll be weird. And I kind of like it when you can see all the panelists because then we know they're listening. And, you know, oh, deep, right? Like, so it's more of a kind of a conversation as opposed to just a lecture. But yeah, I think it's probably better to leave it on. Panelists, just so you know, if you end up speaking, you know, too much, which is amazing because we want to hear everything, one of the facilitators will like gently interrupt, say something or whatever, and it's no diss, it's no foul. We love you. It's just we want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity. Having said that, I don't think we're going to be doing a lot of cutting out. And it looks like we have Dr. Fatima El-Tayeb joining us.
Yeah, hi, sorry.
Hello. I'm so excited to have another literature person in political education with us. So Ebony Tyree is one of the facilitators, also a lit major. And Dr. Danny Widener, unfortunately not a part of the literature bunch, but we let him hang out. And then we have a sociologist up in the mix, a psychologist. Anyways, I just mentioned to everybody that once we get started and are asking the questions, we like to have a free flow kind of a conversation. Some of the questions will be directed towards individuals. Once that individual has answered, other panelists are more than welcome to jump in, to interrupt. If you're having technical difficulties, feel free to reach out to Jean-Louis or Mimi. We're not pretending like they don't exist. Again, it's a community, it's a conversation. If somebody's talking a little bit too long, there might be a polite interjection by one of the facilitators, which is both Danny and Ebony. Danny, do you think you're going to be on it for the length of the event?
I hope so.
Okay, cool. If for whatever reason he's not able to, Ebony and Jean-Louis, you were both there, and so you can help with kind of facilitating and asking questions. I don't imagine that that'll be necessary. One facilitator and 5 panelists is, plenty. But I think it's going to be a great event. Does anybody have any questions before we get started?
Nisha just said, I think they let me in early, but I don't know if she's in here. I don't see her.
Good, guys. About to start talking mess about Nisha.
She said she'd hear us.
Well, she could, what? Oh, I'm just kidding. I wasn't going to say nothing about Nisha.
She said, call it up there scaring folks. I don't know. She heard us.
Hey, Jean, we have to figure out a way to not have people all up in our business before we start.
Charlotte, she said, oh, we in here?
No, it's good. I like it because I think it's like people, it's lively. Because people are like, oh, they're really interested in seeing, panelists are just normal people having regular conversation. It's
yeah,
like,
but you gotta give me a heads up, Jean-Louis.
Dude, I told you there's someone in the attendees.
All mics are hot mics.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started then, everybody.
Hold on 1 second. So Let me stop the video for myself and Mimi, and then we'll mute ourselves as well and give it about 3-second pause and then start.
Okay, hey everybody, I wasn't counting seconds, but I'm gonna assume 3 seconds are over. Welcome to another political education class with Pillars of the Community. Today is gonna be, another really amazing event. It looks like some people that I have a lot of respect for, friends of mine, colleagues, people that I've been, paying attention to and watching make moves are joining us. I can't express how honored I am to have these people be able to be a part of these conversations. And conversations are really how we frame our political education classes. So unlike many political education classes that might have a particular ideology or a particular slant that they're saying this is the correct way to analyze or this is the correct way to look at something, at our political education classes, we prefer to say, hey, we're having a conversation and we hope that that conversation creates critical thinking, new perspectives, ways at looking at views that sometimes we may agree with, sometimes we may not agree with, but again, kind of expanding what we're exposed to and expanding our ability to think through sometimes very complex issues. So one of the things that I always say is that, if we had any type of an ideology, it would be shit is complex. And so that's kind of the overarching vibe or ask that we get from our panelists. So feel free to be you, everybody. And again, we have some questions that have already been prepared for the panelists. We will be monitoring the chat. If there's time, we'll reach out to the chat and field some of those questions based on the amount of kind of time and how the panel is going. Without further ado, what I'm going to do then is I'll do a quick introduction of the panelists that we have, and then I'll allow the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and their organization and kind of what brings them to this conversation today. So I'll go through a quick rundown of everybody who's involved, and then I will go ahead and ask somebody to kind of begin on their personal introduction. So we have Annie Rios, who is, again, a good friend of mine and a lawyer at Otro, Lado. I've been working on it. Hopefully my pronunciation will get better. I'm more than open to chastisement for mispronunciations. We have Adrian Scott, the founder of Transistance and a member of Black Lives Matter San Diego. Yusef Bunchy Shakur, who is a community movement builder and a regular and kind of, I could be considered a regular in some of our political education classes and some of the circles that we have here in San Diego. And he's visiting us from Detroit. And then we have Dr. Fatima El-Tayeb from UCSD. Again, amazing group. Oh, and Dr. Kyra Green. Joining us from the Center for Policy Initiatives. Again, an amazing panel. I'm sure it's going to be a great time. Let me go ahead and start off with Kyra. If you could please introduce yourself and just, briefly who you are and kind of what brings you to this conversation. And then Danny, I'm going to let you kind of call whoever the next person after Kyra will be.
Hey everybody, it's so great to be here with this panel of amazing people. I'm Dr. Kyra Green. I'm the Executive Director at the Center on Policy Initiatives. CPI is a local organization. It's focused on San Diego County. Our mission is to uplift the lives and support the work of working families in the San Diego region. We do that work by doing research. So we produce data on poverty and income and earnings and all the issues that affect working families in this region. We also do coalition work, helping support coalitions that hold government especially accountable on the issues that matter the most. Some of the work that we're doing is especially focused on City of San Diego and San Diego County budgets and bringing people together to use budgets, which are moral documents, right, about what our values are and making sure that they better reflect the needs of our community. We focus, especially in recent years, being really intentional about our racial justice lens, because we recognize that in this country, when you talk about working families, when you talk about working people, that's been a conversation taken over by the white working class and in ways that don't respect the ways in which our folks contribute all the time their labor to making every part of life better. So I come to this work as a sociologist with a focus in race and social movements. I think the sort of concept of intersectionality for me, when I first learned about it as an undergraduate, it just changed my whole life, my understanding of what it meant to think about finding justice for everyone and what that would look like. And so I come to this conversation really interested in hearing how other folks are tangling with that and using that in their work. So happy to be here. Thank you.
I think we have another panelist who might not have been introduced. Annie, I don't remember hearing Khalid mention you, so maybe why don't we swing next to you and you can tell us a little bit about how you come particularly to these questions and this political work.
Hi, thank you everyone. I'm so happy to be here. My name is Annie Rios and Khalid did introduce me, so thank you though for being alert to that. Right now I am a supervising attorney at the organization Otro, Lado. We are a bi-national legal and human rights organization where we service deportees in Tijuana and here in the US, in California, both in San Diego and Los Angeles, we work trying to free people from immigrant prisons. We seek refuge for asylum seekers as well as for all other folks who are detained in an incarcerated state. Let's see, before that I've been working as an attorney for about the past 10 years as a human rights attorney. I have worked with our local rape crisis center representing victims and survivors of domestic violence and sexual assault. And I have also worked advocating alongside folks who are experiencing homelessness and living on the street. I come to this conversation as a queer femme Chicana. I come to this conversation because I love to talk about how we can all come together and burn this shit down. So my pronouns are she, her, and ella, and again, I'm really happy to be here.
Fantastic. Ebony, do you want to make the next call?
Sure. How about we go to our brother Yusef? He spoke at City College some time back, so it's good to see you.
Thank you. Honor and pleasure to be with you guys tonight. I'm from Detroit, and we say what up, though. I am also a member of Community Movement Builders, a national organization that have 6 to 7 chapters across the country. what brings me to this space. I think intersectionality as a term, something that's maybe 10, 12 years old, probably 15 at the most. But in terms of movement building, transformation, it's been always there, right? We just name it. For myself, intersecting my struggles, being raised by my mother, my father being absent, the identities of being a gang member, being in prison, meet my father there, and the transformation that came out of that, not only just from an individual standpoint, but a transformation within the collectiveness of struggling and fighting for liberation. And I think intersectionality also pushes us to continue to dig deeper within our roots and how we connect with other people, and part of our growth. So that's how I see intersectionality as a revolutionary tool to grow and to be in revolutionary movements.
Thank you, Yusef.
Adrian, would you be willing to introduce yourself to those of us and those of us watching in, please?
Hi, everyone. Mix Adrian Donovan Scott. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I am the founder of Transistance Network and one of the organizers behind Black Lives Matter San Diego and March for Black Women San Diego. My organization, the Transistance Network, offers community sports, peer-led community support, navigation, radical resources, and wellness, as well as love and support from folks, Black and brown radical queers and trans folks throughout San Diego who have navigated the systems of poverty, of housing, of homelessness, of drug addiction, of sex work, of literally all the intersectionalities of what it is that we are trying to uplift in our work. So that came about from seeing a lot of folks not being able to, or a lot of Black and brown folks, especially Black trans women, myself included, not as a Black trans woman, but as a Black woman, perceivably Black woman before, and now as a trans non-binary person. Our lack of safety and security when walking through neighborhoods and just generally San Diego, and going out to those established gay resources and having the same, facing the same anti-Blackness within those established communities as we do outside and on the streets. So I founded that so that within my small circle, it was a way for us to have peer community support, real world understanding of what it is that we're actually facing, rather than for anyone who's been through various systems, having to always go to these clinics or these institutions with people who've read books about our lives, but not actual understanding of what it is that it takes to survive, to come up, to navigate those systems. So what I have done on my own time as a poor, degenerate sex worker, trans Black boy, and with the little bit of money that the city had provided me at the time, was give back to those who don't have the opportunities that I have, that don't, or that aren't able to speak the way that I have, that don't maybe have the strength or courage to go to certain institutions and shout them down, or try to correct their anti-Blackness or their homophobia or their transphobia. So it's us boots on the ground, really navigating our lives and reaching out to one another so that nobody is really left behind. And I think that's pretty much how I came to be connected with this discussion. Just my continuous involvement in the community, screaming out to those various institutions, just doing all that it takes in order to survive with whatever I have available to me. So I really appreciate being on this panel as well.
Fantastic. Ebony, maybe we can roll your introduction question, Fatima's self-description into the first.
I was thinking the
question.
same thing. Yes,
Perfect.
we're on the same page. Cool. So Dr. Fatima El-Tayeb, we would ask you to introduce yourself as well. And after that, if you don't mind, just going into beginning our discussion by giving us the background, your understanding of the background of the term intersectionality, and Kimberlé Crenshaw's essay popularizing the term. So introduce, and if you need me to repeat the question, I can.
No, I think I got it. Thank you. So yeah, my name is Fatima El-Tayeb. I teach at UCSD in literature, ethnic studies, and critical gender studies. And my academic work pretty much comes out of my political work, which centers on Black immigrant, queer of color, feminist communities. I'm from Europe, so a lot of my work is centered there, but obviously the issues we're dealing with in Europe and here around racism, other forms of oppression are very similar. So I've been kind of doing the same kind of work here from a queer of color centered perspective. Right now I'm part of a network called Free Them All, which focuses on prison abolition, including immigration prisons, Otay Mesa, but ideally all of them. And yeah, I'm a woman, I'm a lesbian, I'm an immigrant, I'm Black, I'm from a Muslim family, so intersectionality is sort of the obvious way for me to make sense of who I am without having to negate any kind of my identity. And I think that's what intersectionality is about. It's not something that's academic, but that comes out of political organizing, specifically Black feminist organizing, and the realization that communities often tended to replicate the forms of oppression they were fighting. So in order to change that, what's necessary is to, instead of excluding the most marginalized and vulnerable members of a community, center them. And that also means that all forms of oppression must always be on our mind, or as Audre Lorde put it, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. And this is something that Kimberlé Crenshaw theorized in the late 80s using this metaphor at the intersection, starting out with the examples of Black women. So Black women stand at the intersection of racism and sexism, which means that they experience both, different from the ways that Black men or white women experience them. But paradoxically, exactly because they experience both forms of oppression, their experience was usually ignored. When people talked about sexism, they talked about how white women experience sexism. When people talked about racism, they talked about how Black men experienced racism. So that was the context out of which Crenshaw's theorizing came. So intersectionality both looks at why that is the case. Why, if you embody multiple forms of oppression, what tends to happen is that your oppression is negated within a liberation movement. And she looks at the intersecting vectors of oppression that are in play in this process. So basically intersectionality understands that racism, sexism, transphobia, classism, and so on don't just all exist at the same time, but they interact constantly to build a system of racist, heteropatriarchal capitalism that defines an idealized norm and punishes everyone who's different. So if we as political organizers only focus on one form of repression, we tend to reproduce all the others. Or in other words, the norm basically is white, straight, cis, able-bodied, middle class male. And the further you are away from this normal position, the more likely it is that your interest will be ignored even within an oppositional movement, which is, I think, something that we all experienced in various political contexts. One example would be the queer movement's focus on marriage equality, which privileged the interests of white, cis, middle-class gay men, because the major difference between them and what's considered normal is their sexual orientation. Whereas this movement did very little, say, for Black lesbian single mothers who face multiple other forms of oppression other than the one based on sexual orientation. So out of this repeated experience comes the realization that every movement needs to center the interests of its most marginalized members, as you can see right now in the attempt to center the positionality of, in particular, Black trans women within the BLM movement. So if we are attentive to the oppression that they face, we will automatically be attentive to all our oppressions. Whereas if it's a movement or any movement focuses on the interests of only the most privileged or quote unquote normal among us, then it will fail us all. And I see that as the central kind of political message of intersectionality. And another thing that I think is important about intersectionality is that it very much practices that the personal is political. So that's something that doesn't only apply to our political work, but to our interactions in every context, personal relationship, work relationships. We always have to be aware of our positionality in a particular context, and we can't just assume that we're on the same page because we have the same end goal. We always have to reassess our relationship and have to make sure that we don't normalize certain positions at the cost of excluding others. So that's an ongoing process, but I think it's also the process that keeps movements alive. Yeah, so that will be my understanding of intersectionality.
Thank you, Dr. Fatima.
I think that's a fantastic introduction and really clear-sighted and wide-ranging at the same time. And I saw a lot of kind of facial recognition clues that people were vibing with different parts of what got said. And also presumably that people had their own angles and takes. So what I wanted to kind of do is open up from that perspective or that point of departure, a question or a conversation about how our political work reflects the particular experiences of the different communities that we work with or that we see as perhaps our base or the particular political homes or locations that we have. How do those spaces interact with this question of police violence, maybe in particular ways, just as a way to kind of give the folks who are dialed in some sense of the variety of experiences as well as the perhaps common points. So I don't know if there's somebody who wants to take that one on first, but since you're at the top of my screen and I'm on the left and you're at the top of the left, Kyra, why don't we take, maybe you want to start us there?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like for me, part of how I think about this concept of intersectionality and how it affects our work at CPI and how I come to it is just recognizing that, especially around police violence, I want to start before it even gets to police violence, just the question of how people conceive of what the meaning of policing is to begin with, and how it was critical to understand like how people's positions along these different dimensions shape their experiences of it. And so I was thinking about when Dr. Fatima was raising up this issue of like, what's the norm? That in class is slippery. I want to just highlight that. Like class is in some ways the slipperiest of these identities because the norm of class in our society is middle class, but it's not the most privileged, right? And so rich people really, hide in this system a great deal, and especially because their politics shape, and this is something we understood because I think we come from a first starting with this sort of class analysis at CPI, not stopping there, but starting in that place of like, okay, so who shapes the power that we have, and understanding that that power is often class-based with all of these other dimensions, and that notion of policing, that perspective is why we have the systems that we do, because it's about protecting the people who are most privileged and most normal. That's the force to maintain their power and authority. And that it was important to center the experience of just working class people of color, queer folks, about how space was being policed to hold them outside of it, and how that impacted it impacts our ability every day to move about the world freely. I'll just use an example that for me in this work, when we started saying that we would do this, people were like, you do work about wages and working conditions, like why are you talking about policing? And it was just the notion that with all the other struggles that people bring to their day, that we had people during COVID, this is an example of this, that they were being harassed, right, on the streets as they tried to get to work. So they're having to go out in the world and risk their lives under these conditions. Why? Because of the ways in which poverty and race and gender and sex and identity and our sort of control of space, like how all of those come together. We knew who was in those spaces at risk in that way. And then even on the way to that risk, the ways in which policing added to the danger and to the disadvantage that people face. So I just want to say, like, part of like how it situates it for us is really having that conversation and being able to have it with people who are positioned differently in this matrix of identities and who have different relationships to policing, and being able to bring them to this understanding of like, this is about, in some ways, a set of identities that are privileged. And I just want to say that the reason that's so important in our work is because so many of the people who come to it are like, well, how are you talking to me about my privilege? I'm just a regular working person. We're all the same, right? We're all having the same class struggle. And I think the opportunity to point out in really concrete ways, everyday lived ways, that that's not true, that we are not even in the same class struggle because of the ways in which these identities are structured and the way power is structured in our society. So that for us was, it's still a process. I think there are still people who have known CPI, it's, you know, been around since 1997, who are shocked maybe, or maybe even disappointed in some of the ways that we're saying it here, but we understand that if the fight is about freedom, that we have to talk about all the ways in which people are not free.
Thank you. So I'd ask this question of Yusef and Adrian. How do your communities, how do the communities you identify with experience police violence or abuse?
Here in Detroit, the impact of policing is similar to across the country, is very systematic in the sense of Detroit faces high level water shutoffs. We're talking about communities that are below poverty, lack of resources, and similar to other areas, again, policing is supporting property and things of that nature. And their response is, you know, racialized because we live in a very hyper segregated area. So Detroit is a predominantly Black city, but again, the power relationships into electoral supports corporations, and we're surrounded by majority white cities. So there's these borders that we know, which is you know, Detroit is full of what some people say food deserts. So to get you know, high quality foods or even high quality clothes, we have to travel outside of Detroit. Many of us don't have no license. We're impacted with the new form of redlining, which is not taxes, but insurance. You know, I mean, in Detroit, you know, what we pay for insurance, what you guys pay for rent. You know, I mean, it's ridiculous. So all these things are stacked up, right? And then they play out in different ways around gender, around race and class, and they have been consistently impacting poor and Black people. I'm 48 from multiple generations, and we've had at different times different movements, different individuals, and so in this moment, you know, seeing people responding to the police brutality, and as well as the gentrification, And so when Detroit began to participate in the protests and trying to organize and whatnot, first thing that from the petty bourgeois class or the interests of the state, folks like, man, don't burn our shit down. And it was very interesting because, people was organizing protesting downtown. And so in Detroit, we have monopoly in real life. We have 2 white owners, Dan Gilbert and the Illiges. They own pretty much all of downtown. So anything got burned down, it was of these 2 white folks, right? But because of our relationship to the state and the city, our interests or their interests superseded our own interests, right? And so being able to develop, the framework to push people through this discomfort of transformation, or what some would say class suicide. So how we experience police brutality is multi-level. It crosses race, class, and gender, and it has been consistent.
Thank you, Yusef. Adrian?
Yeah, so I think, especially with who I work with, we're on the streets. A lot of us, I myself have come up through being homelessness, drug addiction, sex work. So those are the folks that I usually gravitate towards, and those are the ones that come to me for the assistance. So when we talk about policing, we're of course talking about how it's affected Black folks in general, but Black trans women specifically, or trans folks in general. When cops are called upon us, they have to make a decision on how they perceive, or what they perceive our bodies to be. And from there, we're further demonized, and put under a further microscope, and humiliated for who we are as trans folks. So when I get involved, or even what I've been through my own suffering from abuse from the police, being groped, being fondled, having my body literally searched until it's deemed acceptable, or something worthy enough for them to protect. There's been plenty of times where I've been manhandled because I've been perceived as male, my clothes ripped from me from the police, and institutionalized, not only because they find the criminal act of just trans existence, just being trans a criminal act, but the fact that my being in distress while being trans, and on top of that being Black in front of them, was worthy enough of an attack on my body and my person, my character. So we have it from that level. And then in some cases, when it gets to something so tragic as our deaths or our arrests that become public, then we go through further scrutiny through the media. Our whole lives are brought up, our dead names are brought up, our past, the things that we used to do, or the fact that, say we're sex workers, or the fact that we're poor, we're on the streets. We're not people who are what we have to say is incredible and it's not valuable. So we get out of these institutions only to come back into our own communities and still be treated and policed the same way out from folks that aren't in uniform. I'm sorry, I'm having so many different thoughts and memories coming up for me. Yeah, so policing for particularly people, trans folks, Black trans folks who are homeless, who suffer homelessness, who suffer from poverty, we don't really have many options to turn to except for one another, except for other things that get us further into into their systems and being policed by them further. So when it's like trying to dismantle these things, we can talk a lot about how we need to march for Black trans women, but if you once that hashtag has died down and you go in your houses, what are you actually doing to support trans people? What are you doing to really be there for trans folks? What are you doing to actively bring attention the harm that policing has done to the trans community? And what are you doing in order to build to break down the lack of understanding within your own Black community or Latinx community or non-white community, even the white communities as well? What are you doing in order to further understand what our lives really entail, what it really means to be a poor Black sex worker on the street who's just getting policed? Because we see these videos of, say, like Elijah McCain, who's walking, who's just a cold Black boy, just minding his own business, walking along, and these things happen to us every day. They happen to us every day. We're groped, we're fondled, we're a boy, a girl, a this, a that, we are assaulted every single day without the world watching, and we just have to keep going. On top of that, we have to figure out our next meal. On top of that, we also have to figure out where we're going to get a warm bed, while trying to do it as safely and legally as possible, but it's also a survival. So some laws have to be broken. Those things aren't necessarily always fully addressed when we're talking about how policing really affects us, the PTSD that we have to deal with on a daily basis, the wanting to turn to our own community for so we have alternatives to the police, but realizing that our own community are the ones that are also attacking us as well.
I want to thank you, and we got some really interesting feedback from your comments that I think we could return to. I wanted to ask Annie a version of the same question in terms of the particular experience of police violence in the context of the immigration rights work and the undocumented community that you work with. But I was wondering if you would also be willing to speak to another question, possibly, which is, I'm from LA, like, a few of us are. And of course, that's a place that has seen recently a police murder of a young Latinx man, but also a much longer history of police violence against both the brown and Black community. As a non-Latino person, Latinx person, I've seen in the past what seemed to me a kind of different perception in the community, a different perception, a different reaction on the part of Black and brown political forces, where it seemed that it was almost mandatory for all Black political figures at some level to at least give lip service to the idea of police malpractice. And it seemed like that was a much more difficult hill to get other segments of the Latinx community to engage, whether that would be middle-class people, the business community, elected officials. And that issue of the kind of deserving and the undeserving really seemed to come to the fore. So I wonder if that's a correct perception as an outsider, and if it's something that maybe you organizationally or politically have thought about ways to struggle with, alongside the kind of question about how you see the really critical realm right now of immigration rights in terms of the broader struggle against police violence.
Yes, and thank you for asking that question, because I think that as a Chicana, as a Latinx person, there is racism that we have to look at introspectively within our culture and within our community so that we can address how divisive upholding white supremacy is, not only with others that we can form connections with and seek liberation for everyone, but there's no way that we can find our own liberation when other people are oppressed anywhere. And until that is really recognized from our community, I think that we're always going to be at a standstill. So, and I'll definitely get into more in the immigration justice realm. I think something that is extremely important, as I mentioned, is being reflective and introspective as to what is our role in seeking liberation for all people. And I can give an example with a very, very recent joyous result that we got from the Supreme Court, which is that DACA was upheld. But then comes a narrative of deserving and undeserving migrants. Who are the people that should be allowed to stay in the country and who isn't? And while we can absolutely celebrate and take joy in some form of safety for our people, I think that we also need to explore, what does that mean though? What does it mean when there are some folks who are still seen as undeserving, when Black migrants are more heavily policed once they're inside the United States? So we'll have a criminal history and be subjected to mandatory detention inside of detention centers, immigrant prisons. And for me, what that has meant is really looking critically at who am I upset at and who am I rallying for. I need to turn my anger towards abolishing a border that was erected on land that was never intended to have a border on it. I need to turn my anger towards folks who have defined humans as legal and illegal. I need to turn my energy towards the abolition of these systems and these structures that oppress not only migrants, but everyone, and the intersectionality between how the police and how ICE police are so similar that they're really intrinsically combined with one another. And I don't think that we can even dissect them. So for us as an organization, for me as a person, I know that I have taken time to see when people have been criminally impacted in the past, why that's an important plight for me to speak up and say that continuing to hold them in civil immigrant detention is unconstitutional. And we're in the process of making those arguments. When people have served their time and have now moved over to civil detention in immigrant prisons, we are persecuting these people doubly. And typically those that are criminally impacted are Indigenous folks, are Black folks, and now they're getting re-traumatized by being in civil detention through the immigrant justice system. So that is how I've looked at that. And then extending that discussion to what it looks like within Latinx communities, I think there is a history of anti-Blackness, there is a history of colorism, that until we look at how we are complicit in white oppression, we are never really fully going to be able to surpass that. I've had to look at, as a lighter skinned Chicana, what does that mean? What kind of benefits and privileges have I received because of that? And how do I want to stand in solidarity with my Black siblings as well? So I think you're absolutely right. There is an aura of deserving and non-deserving, and when you want to speak up, and there's whataboutisms, right? So there has been plenty of posts that say, oh, everyone's rallying for the Black Lives Matter movement, but what about the children in cages? And that's where I think this understanding that my liberation is so intrinsically tied to yours that we have to show up for one another in order for us all to be free. And that's what I would ask for my community is to think of that, to reflect on that, to see how we benefited from white supremacy and to see how we can disavow that in order to find our own liberation and stand in solidarity with everybody else.
Thank you, Anne. Well, Dr. Fatima, this question is for you. You shared your background, and so, what explains the activity around Black Lives Matter in Europe, or what is that movement like?
Well, the movement in Europe uses Black Lives Matter, but it existed long before that. What's the difference between Europe in general and the US is that while racism in general, and certainly anti-Black racism, was invented in Europe and is still very much alive there, there's a consensus that it doesn't exist. It's almost impossible to talk about it. The majority of white Europeans really believe that they're colorblind. And they love to talk about racism in the US, but certainly not at home. So growing up, the US was always a focus for us because there was a movement, there was a language. So I think that one of the many levels of intersectionality is of course also the relationship within the African diaspora. But there's anti-Black police violence all across Europe. People are murdered by police, but even more people are murdered by what would be the European equivalent of ICE. So a lot of people die in immigration detention. They are shot, they supposedly commit suicide, or die in other ways. And racial profiling, I think the German Supreme Court declared it illegal 2 years ago. Before that, the consensus was that makes sense. You know, of course, you can make assumptions based on someone's race. So the situation in some ways is very similar, and through this paradoxical situations where Europeans are willing to acknowledge that racism exists in the US, in some ways, Black Lives Matter offered a framework for Black organizations in Europe to connect and to kind of get a public stage, but there are still other issues that are massive. I mean, in Europe or at the border of Europe, since almost 3 decades, there are thousands of people dying every year, drowning in the Mediterranean. And that is something that is not only accepted by European powers, that is something that is produced very violently. The situation right now is so bad that there are no rescue operations for people. People like cross the Mediterranean in tiny boats. Often it's very clear that they won't make it. European navies don't save them anymore. There are private organizations that do that work and they are criminalized. So you have a situation where people who are in their vast majority African and Muslim are just left to die by the thousands. There are thousands of people, 10,000s of people in camps in Europe right now, refugees who have no protection whatsoever from COVID. So there's at the same time a very violent, very explicit racism and a big silence about it. So I think the movement in the US right now was really galvanizing for people, for Black people and other people of color in Europe as a way to connect. That's what's really a global struggle.
Thank you.
We do have a couple of general questions we wanted to ask each of you, collectively, but I wanted just to make a space if after the kind of first round of comments and reactions, there was anything that folks wanted to add or that resonated with them or where they had said, this, I got to remember to say this next time around. So I just wanted to give y'all an opportunity just to kind of go absent us if wanted.
No? Well, I think we could, Danny, we could ask just a question that we came up with out there for the general.
Sure. So one of the, one of the points I think that everybody made individually and collectively is that the language of intersectionality gives us a way to talk about ourselves as something other than a singular community, or you know, a singular community that's a Black community linked to a singular community that's a Latinx community, right? That there's a greater heterogeneity and variation. So I guess from that, I'm interested to know a little bit about whether folks think police accountability, police abolition, community control, any of the languages we might have for a goal or a place we might be trying to reach in this moment, how you feel that looks in the community or in the base or in the place you come out of, and or if you see some danger signs or limitations, or if you have some concerns about where you think things headed, that you maybe think a different lens or framework might allow us to avoid some of the errors or mistakes maybe that we identify previous moments or movements as having made. And anybody should jump in wherever they want.
I'm gonna go ahead and jump in here, and I may not actually be answering the question that you asked me. I may have just like gone somewhere else, and I'll be free with that.
That's cool, because we ask people to say what they want to say in the first place anyway.
Exactly. I was just thinking about, it actually was sparked by listening to the other folks in this panel. It's like a thought I haven't had before, but of just how important it is to think, like, I'm really invested in the idea that as communities, we have the ability to regulate ourselves, to decide what peace looks like, and but what got me thinking about it is all the ways in which we do, like intersectionality and thinking about it that way, invite me to think about my own privileges and how those privileges get used to police space in like a broader way of using that word, right? Like how I, you know, partake in processes of policing other people's bodies, of what's an acceptable body, even as sometimes not even with the intention of policing someone else's body, sometimes being all in my own attempts to like conform or find peace in the space, how I reinforce notions about what is an acceptable body or what's an acceptable way of being. And also it got me thinking about how, you know, I hope in this moment that some of the things I heard from other folks on the panel, but I especially associated with the comments that Annie was making about, like, I also hope for, you know, Black, cis women, that I'm still thinking about this notion of how I have not always stepped into a space of thinking about protecting and standing in true solidarity with my immigrant brothers and sisters and other siblings, right? I haven't always done that because I've thought, not from my privilege, not thinking of it as a privilege, thinking so much about the fact that my own sense of being an American is contested and unclear and like struggling with it. So the idea of speaking in a space when I don't feel like, well, what does that have to do with me? Like learning over the years to grow into a space where I see the importance of it, and I see that it's different, which I think is the other thing about this concept that invites you to see the differences of ways that oppression show up, but how they can be different and similar and the same at the same time, right? So like it's not exactly the same. There's not a state, there's not the same straight structures that police my citizenship, my sense of belonging, but nevertheless, there's a broader structure that questions it in the same way of my right to be here, of, you know, when people say, go home to someone, what does it mean that the response I was taught to give as a Black kid growing up in Kentucky is, I'm already home, as opposed to the language of talking about the right of anybody who wants to call this home, right? Like those types of things I feel like have been sparked in this conversation about how I don't think of myself, I sometimes fail to think about my own privileges and how my adaptations to it actually help serve the system. And I'm worried that we're not doing enough for that. If I'm not doing it, maybe that's also not happening for other people.
So I'll go next. What I'm thinking is like when we look at movements and orgs before us, and we tend to like criticize them, and I think a lot of it is legit, but I also don't think we realize how advanced they was in a lot of their struggles in terms of making the connections. Like in the 21st century, we're still struggling or have more setbacks in around the conversation of intersectionality, the conversations of uniting cross borders and things of that nature. Not to say that they was had it all figured out, but they had a working framework. And I think they was more clear politically in terms of thought, in terms of practice, and I think that's something that we can learn from that. And like all struggles are we won't be the same struggles, but you know, how do we get in a room and have ideological dialogues? How do we sharpen each other? You know, like even with tonight's round, where we say political education, where we're not so sensitive, we're taking everything personal. Again, and I think that this is the lack of true leadership development or organizational development, as some of us identify from COINTELPRO, but also I think just in any movement or any org in a time frame. And I think particularly for this moment, to make sure like we're not perpetuating those things, like, you know, in every city there's new faces, new emergence, which is beautiful, right? But what spaces are they truly developing, right? And how they're holding into past traditions and those who have been doing it. So again, creating those spaces where we can coexist and not fighting with each other. And I think, you know, trying to develop those frameworks will help us move forward, because in the reality, when we talk about liberation, that's a protracted struggle. You know, we may not win it in 10 years. You know, it's a long-term fight. And so as Jamal said, no, we need long-term revolutionaries.
I wanted to thank Kyra for bringing up or recognizing your own privilege, and to add on to that, for other people to realize. And Danny, I apologize if this doesn't even answer your original question, but when we're thinking about our own privileges and policing, and the folks that we're fighting for, the most marginalized, whether or not we're actually bringing them to the table and listening to what it is that they have to say, allowing them to speak and fully address their concerns without the judgment and without the policing of their bodies, their speech, their education or lack thereof, is absolutely necessary in the fight. And the fight for revolution and for their freedom, particularly because so often we get into these moments of uplifting their voices while speaking for them. And if we don't actually take the time to dismantle our own policing of one another, then we won't actually hear their concerns and what it is that they're suffering, the little nuanced things. Because it's one thing to sit back, like in the case of COVID, when all hell broke loose and everyone was like, well, you have to isolate, you have to go home, yet I'm sitting here around 17th and Market, around Petco Park. Where are we gonna go? Where are these folks gonna go? Where do we even have to turn to? We can't even go and ask for directions without being, what do you need directions for? You don't have anywhere to go. You have nothing. And that's a lot of courage, just to, when you've been out on the streets for so long and you're getting hit from every different angle, and literally the threat of your life from these different police agencies are coming at you. The courage that it takes in order just to lift your voice, to ask for help, to ask for directions, are just so often dismissed and go unheard and aren't even really considered in these fights. So and maybe it's biased because I'm uneducated Black trans boy who's been on the streets, but having folks that maybe don't speak so eloquently at the table, and actually listening to the ways in which our daily lives have been affected by not only police institutions, law enforcement, but just the simple policing of how we are to exist in the world, and how we are to, like, being policed as to how we are to emote our anger and our sorrow and our pain. It's one thing to talk about fighting for the most marginalized, but if you're not actually listening to us and putting us there and understanding, breaking down, dismantling your own white supremacy to really build a connection with the most marginalized, and stepping out of your own comfort zone, then you're doing the service a grave disservice. You're doing the work a grave disservice. And as regard to seeing actions in the past where we have self-governed, I think it's become harder because the laws got smarter. And it's one thing to say, let's get out there and vote, let's do this. But if we're not voting smart, and if we're not actually challenging those policies, those policy makers, as well as the folks in the office, if we're not actually being smart and saying, these things are not right, this and this and this and this is not right, this has to change, and holding those folks accountable. I am all for guerrilla tactics, and that's just me. I'm one person. I am not saying this as a representation of those orgs. However, you know, it's 2020 and we only have but so much time, and it's on their watch. So I'm tired, and I think that I think it's come to a time where we have enough folks, if we just come together and put down our own, like, realize that dismantling white supremacy also means that we, from our places of various privileges, have to sacrifice as well. That it's not just, oh, we're trying to even out the pie. We're also taking away from our own privileges as well, so that it's a more of an even playing field.
Thank you, Adrian. So I have a question, and anyone can take it, but it's about intersectionality. And so why do you think, or, you know, why does this happen, if you believe it does? Intersectionality, like, poses a threat to communities that are generally centered, right? Why do you think it's like such a sensitive matter, or folks get, you know, aroused by this this term or this theory of intersectionality?
I'll go ahead and answer that, because I think that Adrian was very eloquent about explaining that when we start to dismantle what white supremacy typically looks like, and when we start to address our own privilege, it means we get less than, or we invite other people to the table that we were normally seated at with very limited seats, and we felt like we earned that and we deserve that and we should be there. And all of a sudden somebody's telling you, get up and move, so that you can make room to hear other voices, and so that you can make room to start dreaming and idealizing what we want this community to look like and what we want it to be. And it's very difficult. I think it is very, very difficult to do that. So I just a really quick answer, because I don't think people want to give up their privilege. I don't think people want to give up what they have already established. And when we start talking about intersectionality, it forces people to address their own privileges, how they benefit, and you're asking for somebody to give up some of their pie. And I think it's just as simple as, I don't want to. Oh, and really, really quickly, just addressing the last question, because I wanted to bring up the topic of being an abolitionist while also thinking of what accountability might look like for folks who have harmed communities. And I'm really excited about that. I will constantly say that I think dreaming of what a future without police looks like is fascinating, and it makes me so enthusiastic of what our new future can look like, precisely because of the intersectionality that we hold as activists, as organizers. If we do have that table, or whatever we want to call it, it may not even be a table anymore, whatever we do have, if we look at how we want to see justice, we can imagine that. And if we want to see accountability, we can dream that. And I think Black, Indigenous, people of color dreaming is resistance to white supremacy. And maybe it doesn't look like one cop goes to jail. Maybe it looks like every time a cop kills somebody, we release 10 people from death row. Maybe that's what accountability looks like. Maybe we start dreaming of what our justice can look like. So I'm really excited about headed towards a place where we don't have police and we don't have prisons. Yeah, thank you.
Do other folks want to speak also to the question that Ebony posed? Ebony, do you want to maybe say it again?
Like I have more. Yeah, I have more questions. I could build on that a little bit too. But yes, it was just about why does it, cause so much upset in communities that are centered. But I also want to ask the question about, how does, I guess, the institution of our enslaved people and Blackness play a role in how does it complicate, right, or cause some of these issues to be complex within the Black communities? Can we address, or does anybody want to address some of the complexities associated with intersectionality in terms of Blackness?
I think in terms of, as we continue to redefine or define what Blackness is, right? It challenges us to confront what Blackness has not been, and as we continue to grow and develop through different struggles, particularly with Black men and how the shaping of Black men within the struggles, right? And now we're at a place of reimagining what that looks like in the greater scheme. And also, one of the things, however we may feel about Black Lives Matter as a movement, it has ushered in, Black trans, Black queer, Black women in a way that has never been at the forefront of our movements, to be able to have conversation around sexual identities and whatnot, which are same thing that we're wrestling with white folks, right? This comfort conversation, but again, as I alluded to earlier, these are political conversations. They're tied to class suicide. They're tied to transformation. Again, me as a Black man who stands as a Black nationalist, revolutionary, if I'm truly fighting for liberation, then I should be fighting for liberation for all Black people. As a revolutionary, I should be fighting for liberation for all people. Again, this is a principle that I stand on. Then there's mechanics within that sometimes we don't even realize that we still fall short with, even as we say we're putting ourselves on these pedestals. And my relationship to patriarchy, in terms of just being a man and continue to dissect that, and where I may fall short, but being in the space where I can hold myself to someone holding me accountable to that, because of the principles and the beliefs that I believe in, that it goes beyond my own individual self.
Thank you.
I just wanted, from that, I just wanted to say one quick thing, which is, a few folks talked about older moments or movements that existed before. And I just wanted to say, one thing I would really encourage everybody who's in the audience to take a look at is really the history of the Young Lords Party. The Young Lords came out of the Puerto Rican community. They're part of this same moment with the American Indian movement and the Berets and the Panthers and everybody. But as far as I know, they were really the most critical of anti-Blackness within the Latino community, of patriarchy, of homophobia, that they made the most sincere effort, like all organizations, with mixed success. But I think the Young Lords are one of the organizations that folks who are around today, especially those of us in California, places without large Boricua communities, really can look at and learn from, not adopt wholesale, but it is an important organization, and one that sometimes gets lost for those of us who don't come from the Puerto Rican community. Last week, we had a speaker who's been politically active since the 1960s and who was one of the founders of the first police monitoring projects in the United States and in the world. And he raised the possibility of community organized police monitoring as a kind of interim step that centers community control, that's confrontational, but that obviously is not the same thing as full abolition. And I just wanted to get people's sense and of course that came out of a very specific moment, decolonization, armed struggle, all that kind of stuff. But he was very enthusiastic about it. And I wanted to ask people their thoughts about what the possibilities, usefulness, desirability of a system or a situation where we tried to be the eyes on the cops in all of the different ways, in all the different, kind of spaces that we pass through, and what that might look like, and whether or not it's something that people think would be a positive practice.
I wanted to say first to your first point, Danny, that there's a difference, of course, between how movements play out and the stories we tell about them afterwards. So there are like lots of examples in history of queer people, of trans people being very central to movements, but that story gets erased again and again because somehow it seems more powerful to focus on unity, but unity then means erasing difference. And I think what's so powerful about intersectionality is that it sees difference as a potential and not something to fear. And that's something we all learn, right? And this is why, as has been said, it's so hard for us also to acknowledge our privileges, because we have to admit that we have something that we shouldn't have. And I think that working on that and building alternative structures, I think personally is more productive than focusing on the police. There's of course also the question of allyship, in particular white allyship, and if that would be a job for them. But I think what is exciting about the moment now is that for the first time, I feel there's a broader group of people that goes beyond this panic reaction of, if we abolish the police, who's going to protect us? And I agree with Anne that it's really exciting to think about a system where we realize what is protected is mostly our privileges and we don't really need them. So how do we replace that with? So I would be more interested in focusing on our communities and how we interact. But that doesn't exclude, of course, the possibility to watch the police, but I'm not sure how much that can actually do right now.
Thank you. Anyone else want to address that? I have another question. We have some questions kind of coming from outside that sparked an interest as well in terms of police accountability and defunding the police, and this conversation of intersectionality. And Dr. Abdimalik Bull is asking, are we having an intersectional approach to defunding, police or law enforcement currently? Are we, not addressing Border Patrol, Homeland Security, and TSA for our Latinx and Muslim population? So I guess the question, kind of is, how intersectional should we be, or how layered should it go?
I can say one thing about, I'm sorry.
No, go on.
Please, after you, Adrian.
Well, I was just going to say that I think for a lot of the folks who are in abolition work or are holding police accountable are very intersectional, are doing the work across the board. When it's talking about kids in cages, we're also talking about Haitian immigrants as well. We're also, those who are doing the work are intersectional as best as possible. I think, unfortunately, in relaying it to the mass public, it becomes so divided. It becomes, you're either for Black life or you're for the kids in the cages, and there's no in between. But those of us who are behind the scenes, who are boots on the ground, who are doing the work, are fighting across the board. We're fighting for Black life. We're fighting for children. We're fighting for immigrants of all races and genders. So yeah, Kyra.
If I learn how to unmute, it'll work. So I was just, I mean, I feel like it was inspired by the same point, Adrian, this idea that also, yes, we are not yet having, I think the people who've been doing this work have been thinking in intersectional terms, absolutely. I also think when we talk about the people who are newly coming into this work, into this movement, there's a lot of work that people have to do. I think all movement work is also your work. It's like, you got to do this inside of yourself. And I think in particular, understanding that the same way we talk about privilege and our identities as being like this spatial relationship, it was Dr. Fatima that was describing, like, you know, our distance from privilege or our closeness to privilege. And I was thinking about how like that is our closeness to privilege, our relationship to privilege is almost directly proportional in some cases to our relationship to police, right? So in the community I live in, we had an action, I guess it's been almost a month now. People showed up, it was peaceful, but the people who have had the best relationship with police historically, even though they're in this moment being radicalized, like they're not necessarily thinking about the safety of the other. They're not able to clearly see the way the choices they're making are keep creating danger for other people, because even though their minds are opening up a little bit, right, or maybe a lot for them, it feels like, but there's still a moment where it's like, yeah, but the folks who are most marginalized, who I believe, should also set the conditions for how much risk we're willing to take. Because you can take all that privilege and decide you want to have a confrontation in this moment. But are you thinking about the fact that when the violence comes back, it's probably not going to be directed at the person who feels the most privileged and the most open to do it. It is consistently, like, I'll be really personal about it. I am married to a white person. And I remember the first time he was ever pulled over by the police. He started talking the way he's used to talking to the police, right? Like he was just having like a chat. He was moving his hands all around. He was just like, you know, he was having, and I was like, right, when they decide it's dangerous, you're not the person they're gonna shoot. When they decide that this is unruly behavior, you're not the person who's getting thrown to the ground. That is my consistent experiences of not just policing, right, of any kinds of attempts to of the oppressive system to like exercise itself directly. And so I think there's just work that we have to do as we do this work with folks to bring them along. I don't think that's meant to shame anybody or discourage them from engaging in this work. I think it's exactly the purpose of this kind of space of political education, where we have real conversations about our intent and then our responsibility as we step into this space. Our responsibility is to recognize privilege and then think about at every moment, what privileges am I experiencing right now? How is it influencing my activism even? And what I think is safe, and how do I learn? And I'm going to be learning this the rest of my life. How do I learn to stop and ask the person in the most danger and the most risk in this situation, where is your comfort level? Where do you want to be in this movement? And I think if we did that, if I started talking about it, I must have heard it somewhere, I don't know where, and I'm sorry that I don't remember, but like about moving at the speed of the people and the speed of us moving as a people together. And so I don't think that separates out from having like our dreams of abolition. I think we should dream as big. We should not slow down the size of our dreams, but sometimes the speed of our action and the risk of our action, I think, does not reflect truly deeply intersectional thinking.
Thank you, Kyra. Anyone else want to address that? Danny, do you have anything? I was just even, thinking about, the original question, and I think, Kyra, you may have addressed some of that, but how do we, you know, juggle the complexities of that when, especially now, we're saying, you know, there's a focus on, you know, Black lives. And I think initially, in my opinion, it was Black males in particular. And then, you know, I don't know, how do you all feel about that? Does intersectionality, and then this is, you know, I like this because I like this kind of, does it for lack of a better term, dilute, you know, some, like, how can it become dangerous for us to, you know, play around with that? How do we deal with that, right? How do we juggle what could be lost, right, as we you know, work on being intersectional, which we think is very important work. I think it's a tough question. I don't know, but yes, how what do you all think? I mean, do we just not?
Well, I don't think intersectionality means that you can't prioritize particular struggles at particular points, as long as you keep in mind that they're not all or the most important. They're the most important right now. And exactly because you understand that those struggles are connected, you can pull yourself behind whatever the focus on Black men. If you're not a Black man, that's totally not the point if you have an intersectional approach. So I think that's an argument that's very often used against intersectionality. You're either this or that. If you're for that, you're not for this. But it's really it's just an attempt to divide, I think, because yeah, intersectionality absolutely doesn't mean to say, well, you're privileged in this regard, so I won't stand behind you. That's absolutely not what it is.
I think it's also, I agree very much with that. And I also think that it's difficult to answer the particular question you pose in an answer that's supposed to cover everything, right? To give you two examples, we see people in the street now exposing vulnerable people to danger and to really vicious police violence. Some of us were in La Mesa and we saw it, right? But I'll give you a different example. The first sustained political struggle I was in was around the liberation of Southern Africa. And at that time, especially at the universities, the students who were most eager to have a physical confrontation, not just fighting with the police, but building the shanty towns, defending the shanty towns, were white students, a lot of whom came out of the more kind of anarchist, non-hierarchical tradition. And a lot of the Black students made the point that we were likely to be exposed to the most violent police because we're in Los Angeles and the fucking police were exposing us to violence anyway. Looking back from 30 years now, the confrontation that happened with the state against the students was necessary to getting us toward divestment from Southern Africa. And something similar is going to be necessary to get us to divest from Palestine, fossil fuels, all the kinds of places where we have to move. Bodies are going to be broken. And so what the process is going to be where movements democratically can decide the circumstances under which people are going to take those risks, who's going to take the risks in the heat of the moment, what happens with provocations, provocateurs, all that kind of stuff is really, it happens in the moment and in the mix. So it's hard. I just want to say that it's difficult sometimes, I think, for us to put in practice some of the different arguments about how to be democratic, how to take cognizance of people's different places that they enter, and movement building. That's why we tried to have different perspectives and we tried to bring multiple voices and we tried to have a conversation that people could hear different things in. I think because it's very difficult to answer those kinds of questions concretely in the absence of actually building a movement. So the movement we have now or the activity we have now, I think may answer some of those questions differently than they got answered around Central American solidarity, the sanctuary movement in the 80s, the struggle with the police in the 90s. You know, we're building, you know, we're building as we go. But I think the place of confrontation is an important one, and I don't want to abandon it, because I think at the end of the day, the changes that we want are about forcing people who hold power to give up power. And all of us are going to be exposed to a great deal of violence, like the violence. I know a lot of you guys personally, so I know you have experienced that violence prior to now, and it's not going to go away. You know what I mean? And I think Huey P. Newton, who's a guy who, you know, he's a very checkered historical figure, but he said something clear. He said, none of us gets out of here alive. And I think that's the political reality of being a Black person, an Indigenous person, a Latinx person in this society. We won't survive, you know, and we didn't come here to survive. We came here to demolish what couldn't be saved.
Yes, thanks. That's true. And so it's good to have dialogue, right, and conversation. I mean, that's why we're here today. And, you know, we really appreciate you all taking your time to come and speak to us. It's been very informative. Any last, should you all want a roundtable, anything you would like to share for our viewers or for us in regards to the community work that you do, or about the topic we have here of intersectionality and police accountability?
Or any shout outs to directions you want to point people to maybe get involved with things that you may have going on that you think people should know about and hear.
So I add real quick. I think in terms of intersectionality, it's not a simplistic word or terminology that we can just grab hold to. I think there's a lot of folks who began to use it where it's been co-opted and misconstrued that have led to a lot of the confusion. And I think fundamentally intersectionality is a struggle word. We have to struggle through our differences to reach to a certain level. So to the point around, you know, particularly to Black people and other oppressed people, we're all oppressed. As a Black man, I may be oppressed differently than a Black woman. A Black woman is oppressed differently than a Black trans, and et cetera, et cetera. But part of that work is what it is. It's work. But I think too many of us will get lazy. Too many of us want to take shortcuts and run through the alleys and not go down the long streets and want to get in the rooms and struggle through the real shit. And the real shit is being discomforted and finding the commonality and the common ground to our struggles. Again, you know, principally, if I'm saying for the liberation and I'm just upholding Black men, that's a contradiction. It's a contradiction to the struggles and vice versa. So again, how do we, you know, find our medium ground? To today, if the struggles are pushing the agenda around Black trans, let's get behind it. If the struggles tomorrow is about Black men, Black women, it's within the umbrella of Black folks, and we're pushing the struggle around Black people. Ultimately, where we're trying to get to it. So I think, you know, trying to develop those mechanisms to work through those struggles to advance the overall struggle is what it's about.
I just wanted to say that if you're going to do this work, if you're going to get involved, if you're going to educate yourself, realize that this isn't a hashtag, this is a movement, which means it's ongoing. It has to continuously move. And in order for it to continuously move, you have to check your ego. A lot of what we're up against is our own ego. It is just not wanting to give up. So in order to really further this and keep it going, keep progressing what it is that we're working towards, it is realizing that this is for the betterment of all of us. If we're just starting with one thing, it's for the betterment of everything. The civil rights movement led to open the door for so many other folks so many other folks in ethnicities and cultures around the globe to make their way to this American freedom or whatever, but with checking our ego is unpacking our privilege so that we can allow ourselves to be educated. So that we can allow ourselves to be educated in the right way, so that everybody has a chance at the microphone.
Rios, do you have anything? Taya, anyone before we close? I think, there's Khalid, but yeah, any final words?
Echoing what others have said before me, that this is a movement, this is a long-term goal. And for everybody who has joined recently, dialogue, discourse, that's all welcome. But I encourage folks who have just recently started to be engaged with the movement towards abolition or any kind of movement to take the time to fall back and look at who the leaders are and learn from those leaders. So I've never met somebody who's an abolitionist who says we should really get rid of the police, but I'm down with CBP, or I really like ICE. No, nobody in that. And so that question could have, we can take the time to learn from people who have been doing this work for a long time and see that intersectionality already exists, that the people who have been doing this work have been struggling internally, have been struggling within their communities to already try and achieve this or come as close to achieving this as possible. So I'm totally down with everybody that wants to join. I'm extremely happy that people are now invested, but I also think there's a time to know when you need to fall back and when you need to learn and take the lead from people who have been doing this, or from people who you should be learning from.
If I could, I just want to make sure that I say to folks that this movement is also, all movements are both and. So it's about both defunding the police, but I also want to raise up the work that I'm a part of, and so many people here are part of, through the Community Budget Alliance in the City of San Diego and the Invest in San Diego Families work. It's both about defunding the police, but it's also that people have dreams and visions for our communities, and that it's about breathing life into those things that we also want, not just what we don't want. I think those can live together, and they do in this work. And so just encouraging people to come find out more about it, bring the perspective of the organizations and communities you bring, because what we do know in the work that we do at CPI is that we have people who are amazing, but there are more of us, and there's more, and this is not a table that has any limits. So like there's space for all of us to bring our vision and our dreams and our bodies and our work and our minds to this space. And so I would hope that people go check out the CPI website, cpisandiego.org, and get connected to the mailing list, come join us. Like, that's why I'm here, because the thing I forgot to say at the beginning of this is that my people, I always should say that, my people are all oppressed people. That's the moment of my knowing my connection to other people is through oppression. That's the truth. So thank you all for this.
Well, I'll go ahead and jump in there. That's a good place to kind of leave off. The idea that anybody would not want to fight for somebody who is oppressed is an extremely problematic idea. And until we begin to kind of look at things and live outside the kind of the rules and the identities and the categories that have been put upon us, and look at things as the oppressor and the oppressed, and recognize that, as we always say, that shit is complex. We're going to have a long way to go. So again, man, what an amazing panel. Thank you so much. I'm just, so honored and blessed to know each and every one of you, to have had the opportunity for you to come. Once again, we would not be able to do this if it wasn't for all of our background tech. And so Mimi and Jean-Louis, I don't know if you're there, but if you can make yourself seen, if we can draw back the curtain so everybody can appreciate you. I know that's kind of putting you on the spot, and so I'm not going to insist, but thank you, Jean-Louis. We love you, man. You've been a huge support, a huge ally, and I would argue co-conspirator. Mimi is one of our leaders at Pillars of the Community, an integral part of the Umoja program at San Diego City College. just two amazing people that we're blessed to have with us and to be working and making sure that all of these things go. So again, we don't always have control over starting on time. I think we did today, but what we do have control over is ending on time. And so I'm not going to take anybody else's time. Thank you, everybody, again. There is going to be a recording of this. And we also usually set up a Google Doc to put all of the different texts that were mentioned. The organizations that have been involved, we can put links onto that too, so you can get involved. You could be a part of the struggle. And the last thing that I will say is, you know, intersectionality, the word is being used a lot, all the time. I highly recommend that people read the article. It's not necessarily the most accessible article, but it is definitely worth the effort. Read the article. Hey, watch the TED Talk if you want to watch the TED Talk. But let's inform ourselves about the things that we talk about, so that, again, so that we can learn and continue these very kind of critical conversations with one another. Again, thank you, everybody. I'm going to peace out. And then Jean-Louis is probably going to leave it on so that I can continue making a full talking while everybody else is listening. But hey, I appreciate everybody. Thank goodness for editing.
Thank you very much.
See y'all next week.
Peace.
Bye. Thank you.
Yeah. And now everyone quiet and all the stuff, attending, leaving, is should be stop recording.